Welcome back, focused learners. Today we're unpacking a truly groundbreaking sociological text, Dr. Carter G. Woodson's 1933 book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, we aren't just reading history today, we're deconstructing what Woodson laid out as a deliberate blueprint. He argued that what a lot of people saw as a flawed educational system was actually functioning exactly as it was designed to. So let's look closely at how he framed this. To anchor ourselves in the historical context, let's reconstruct Woodson's iconic title. Think about the prefix he uses, the miss. Woodson wasn't arguing that Black Americans were being denied education entirely in the early 20th century. Instead, he argued they were receiving a very specific, completely misdirected type of instruction. You see, he viewed this educational system not as a series of well-intentioned accidents or, clumsy implementations. To him, it was a highly systematic program. According to Woodson, the curriculum, the textbooks, and the teaching methods were all carefully curated to produce a very specific societal outcome. It wasn't about uplift at all. It was about psychological conditioning. And that brings us to the full title. Woodson's core thesis, which we're exploring objectively today through his text, was that the American educational system of his time was purposefully structured to psychologically, economically, and politically subjugate Black Americans. He firmly believed it was designed to make them accept an inferior status without question. Okay, let's dive into this. To truly understand how this miseducation functioned, we're going to examine 4 societal pillars. First, the mind and heritage. Second, the wallet and economics. Third, the soul and religion. And finally, the ballot and politics. Starting with our first pillar, number 1, the mind and heritage, focusing on psychological control. Woodson argued that while physical control is temporary, psychological control is permanent. True control begins right in the mind, specifically by dictating how a person views their own heritage and their own worth. He captured this in what is arguably his most powerful premise. Listen to this. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. This asserts that the educational system was actively training Black students to self-subjugate by convincing them of their own inferiority. Let's see how this builds historically. In the sequence Woodson lays out for post-Civil War education, around 1865 you had philanthropic and missionary efforts, which he notes were well-intentioned but completely out of touch with the actual needs of the freedmen. Then, by 1890, a massive wave of industrial education swept the country, but as he points out, it often trained students on obsolete machinery, leaving them totally unprepared for modern factories. Then by 1900, there was a push for classical education, teaching abstract philosophy to people who were largely laborers or peons. Every single one of these historical waves ultimately missed the mark in truly developing the Black community because none of them were tailored to their actual environment. And this brilliantly illustrates his point. Imagine sitting in that classroom. Students were extensively taught European supremacy, Greek art, and Roman philosophy, but completely omitted was any mention of African science, the powerful Songhai Empire, or the African discovery of iron. By intentionally erasing African achievements from science, history, and literature, the system manufactured a sense of racial inferiority. A student taught this curriculum could only conclude their race had contributed absolutely nothing to human civilization. Moving on to number 2, the wallet and economics, looking at financial independence. We really have to ask, how did that mental conditioning inevitably impact financial independence? If you're taught you have no historical worth, how does that translate to the business world? Well, Woodson hooks his readers with a fascinating rhetorical question. Why do highly educated individuals fail in business? Why were the Black college graduates of his day struggling to build economic independence, while sometimes less formally educated individuals were finding massive success? You can really see the disconnect he identified here between practical community businesses and an impractical university focus. On the one hand, you had real, immediate economic opportunities within segregated communities, things like groceries, steam laundries, and fruit stands. But on the other hand, business schools were exclusively teaching the psychology and economics of Wall Street. They were preparing Black students for a corporate world that legally and socially barred them from entering, while simultaneously teaching them to look down on running a local grocery or fruit stand. The economic result was pretty devastating. Education essentially trained students to be employees in a white system, a system that largely wouldn't hire them, rather than entrepreneurs in their own communities. Woodson argues they were educated away from practical community building, taught to despise small trades, and left begging for a chance in an economy that entirely excluded them. It's a profound critique of how abstract education can literally hinder economic survival. Which brings us to number 3, the soul and religion and the fracturing of the church. Woodson noted that the Black church was historically the great independent asset of the race. But look at the domino effect of this religious disconnect. The highly educated elite, believing themselves intellectually superior because of their schooling, abandoned the popular grassroots churches of the masses. Instead, they sought out more fashionable, ritualistic churches, even if it meant accepting segregated seating. By leaving the grassroots churches, they abandoned the masses to untrained, sometimes corrupt leadership. Furthermore, instead of focusing on practical social uplift, these leaders relied on outdated, abstract theology borrowed from the very society oppressing them. Now for our final pillar. Number 4, the ballot and politics and weaponized education. All of this required deliberate political disenfranchisement, starting right in the classroom. Woodson details how political education was entirely neglected, or worse, weaponized. In many schools, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were literally withheld from Black students so they wouldn't learn to contend for their guaranteed rights. History was aggressively rewritten by propagandists to justify slavery and portray Black political participation during Reconstruction as a disastrous failure. This intentional psychological conditioning successfully created deep voter apathy, leaving whatever remaining political activity there was completely vulnerable to sheer corruption. And finally, the conclusion: the estrangement of the educated. Woodson's most urgent warning across all these pillars centers on the educated elite and their ultimate estrangement from the people they were supposed to help. So the crucial point is this: merely imitating the oppressor's educational system only perpetuates the subjugation. If you take a system designed to maintain a racial hierarchy and just put Black students through it, you aren't liberating them, you are just training them to accept their place at the bottom of that hierarchy. True education, he insists, must begin by understanding the specific environment and the actual people it is meant to serve. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from Dr. Woodson. He wrote, "The mere imparting of information is not education. Above all things, the effort must result in making a man think and do for himself." It forces us to ask a really difficult question, even today. Are our educational institutions actually teaching us to think critically and independently, or are they merely imparting information designed to make us fit quietly into a predetermined social order? It's an absolutely powerful blueprint to reflect on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.